Good morning, Charles Spencer. How are you?
Very well, thanks, Imogen.
Congratulations on your fantastic book, The White Ship, which I have here.
Oh, well, wonderful. Thank you for showing it. Yeah, it was fun to write. I have to say, I'm not a medievalist, and normally I write about the English Civil War in the 17th century. So to go back to sort of English 1 when I was at Oxford University, that's the paper I was trying to reconnect with, and to get stuck into a story with such riveting characters. That's what drives me about history.
I can't tell you, it is a rocking read. I mean, it's completely brutal. I mean, they absolutely tore 10 tons out of each other.
They did. There was no messing about then. I think it was a very sort of dog eat dog world, really, especially among rulers. If you didn't get a grip, usually of your opponent's eyeballs or genitals, you were going, which is the main torture ways, you were going to suffer. It was brutal. And you had to, if you wanted to stay in power, you had to be brutally harsh on those around you. And that certainly was the case with I guess the hero of the book is King Henry I, who's rather an unknown figure to most of us, and certainly was to me. But he really did get a grip on England and set up various institutions that we still live with today, including the Exchequer, the basis of our finances in England, of course.
It all kicks off with the sinking of the White Ship, which happened on the 25th of November, 1120, which is 900 years ago this year, which is, I presume, the reason why you wrote it. But which started what's known as the anarchy, effectively. So could you tell me a bit about?
Yes, I would maintain, not because I've written this book, but that there's never been a more disastrous shipwreck in British history than that of the White Ship. And of course, this is a period that's not taught in schools and hasn't been for decades. But 900 years ago, the youngest son of William the Conqueror, Henry I, had one legitimate male heir, William the Eighthling, equivalent to the Prince of Wales, really. And he was the sort of, not only the apple of his father's eye, but the future. He was the future King of England and the future Duke of Normandy. And Henry I was a very fertile chap. He had 22 illegitimate children, but William was his sole legitimate male heir, very important for the future of the country and the dynasty. And he got on the White Ship, and he and his very important party of co-travelers got monumentally drunk, persuaded the crew to join in the revelry. And then a mile off the northeast coast of Normandy, in the middle of the night, exactly 900 years ago, as you say, Publishers' Love and Anniversary, they all came undone. And there's, luckily for me, there's one eyewitness, a butcher who had got on board this very sort of highfalutin ship. It was in many ways the Titanic of its day. And in fact, when I was pitching it to the publishers, I said, I don't want to sound trite, but this is Game of Thrones meets Titanic. And it's a moment in history of incredible, unutterable unhappiness. When Henry I is given the news that his son and some illegitimate children, nephews, nieces, treasured courtiers and generals have all gone down in this wreck, he falls down screaming in agony at the news. And they say that for the remaining 15 years of his reign, he never smiled again. Certainly, he never produced another male heir. And that meant that when he died, although he had his barons and bishops swear to uphold the succession of his daughter, Matilda, as soon as he died from eating too many lampreys, a sort of eel, in stepped the one man who had been clever enough to get off the White Ship, Henry's nephew, Stephen of Blois. And he seized the throne, and it resulted in a terrible civil war. In fact, people said that blood had descended on the land, and just England was completely ungovernable and ungoverned for 2 decades. And then out of the shipwreck again, because there's still no heir, that was the end of the Norman dynasty. And after Stephen, in came the Plantagenets, and they were the ruling family from the middle of the 12th century until Henry VII won the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. So this shipwreck led to the most extraordinary changes. And if you think if William the Eighthling had survived, we would not have heard of Richard the Lionheart or King John or any of these people, because they'd have been distant cousins and of no interest.
But it is fascinating how fate plays a part in all of this. Because, I mean, Stephen of Blois, the only reason why he didn't get on the white ship was because he was too plastered to make it.
Yes. The chroniclers, who tended to be churchmen, had to sort of dress that up, and they said he had an upset stomach. Well, yes, he did, because he had drunk too much. But no, there is an element of, I'm sorry to go back to popular culture, but there is very much an element of sliding doors about this. You know, Stephen, if he had got on board, would certainly have died. The only man who survived, the butcher I touched upon, the only reason he did survive is because he was dressed differently to the others. And he was wearing sort of goat skin and sheep wool and things that, you know, I'm not a scientist, but I had to look into this. But even if they're wet, as long as you're not in the cold, and this butcher had clambered onto a bit of broken mast, they do have some heat retention. Whereas the noblemen on board all had fine silks and, you know, sheep, not sheep things, but sort of wolf fur and things, which got waterlogged and just added to the quickness of their death, I think.
Gosh, extraordinary. But also it's rather romantic in a sort of a weird way that William goes back to save his half-sister. I mean, he was actually safe in a lifeboat, so he could have carried on. But in fact, through loyalty, which is unusual because none of them seem to have any loyalty whatsoever, he actually goes back to save his half-sister.
I think you're right, half right. I think it was loyalty, but also shame. So she was stuck on this split in two ship on a rock, and she saw him being bundled away by his bodyguard, as you say, in the one sort of lifeboat. And she's not just screaming for her life, but she's calling him all sorts of names for deserting her. So he does what he should have done probably all along and orders his little rowing boat to turn around to come and get her. But unfortunately, a lot of the people thrashing around in the water saw this lifeboat as the only hope that they had and tried to clamber on board, and they all went down, pretty much everyone. And in fact, the eyewitness accounts are so sort of credible and heartbreaking. So you have the captain of the ship, who bizarrely was the son of the captain of the ship that took William the Conqueror over in 1066 for the invasion. He swims up to Barreau the butcher and says, "Have you seen the prince?" And Barreau says, "Yes, I saw him. He went down in exactly the way we just discussed." And then the captain of the ship decides to kill himself, let himself drown, because he cannot bear to face Henry I. I mean, Henry I was not good in a good mood, but if he had lost his children, I think it would have been a terrible end. So he chose just self-drowning rather than any other fate.
Do you think, when you said Henry I was not good, even in a good mood, do you think they were just sort of bilious and liverish most of the time through the amount of alcohol and meat they were imbibing at the time?
Yeah, I don't think they were very well at all, and they aged much more quickly. So, of course, if you look at the average age that people lived to among the aristocracy at this time, it's really nothing. It's sort of late 30s. But if you peel away the infant and child mortality, they had a chance, you know, of getting to 60 or so, but not in good health. I mean, you know, just think of the dental hygiene for a start. And as you say, they did drink like crazy. And I mean, Henry I slept with an enormous number of women, and you'd assume that there might be the odd unwelcome souvenir from that. And so all in all, he had a wretched sort of punishing schedule, daytime and night, and they were in battles the whole time. And you know, kings in those days led from the front, and they were getting battered about. There were several times when Henry nearly got killed in battle. And I think life, you know, it was pretty short and brutish most of the time, and I don't think you were well after your 30s.
And so how did you research all of this? I mean, I read that your way into the story was through Empress Matilda, when you were asked to speak at a
well, yes. That was very strange. So all my books come about for the oddest of reasons, but I love a good story. I'm not an academic historian. I am a what they call a popular historian, which means I'm writing for people who enjoy a good read that happens to be hopefully correct. And I try and find stories that have been forgotten. And about 5 years ago, I was asked at the last minute, somebody had written a kind review about a book I'd done a while back. And clearly there's no such thing as a free good review, because she then called in a favor. She does, Alison Weir, who's a lovely lady, a very prolific author. She does a series of tours for overseas visitors, and she needed a keynote speaker that night for a speech in Leeds Castle on the Queens of England. And I thought, well, I knew they were a knowledgeable bunch, and I knew they'd know about Lady Jane Grey and Boadicea and Elizabeth and Victoria. So I thought, who can I surprise them with? So I brought in the story of the White Ship, because that made the way clear for Henry's only legitimate daughter, the Empress Matilda. She was called the Empress because she had married the Emperor of Germany, to become Queen of England. But she didn't actually become queen, because I'm afraid the prejudice at the time against women rulers was overwhelming. And some of it you can sort of understand, even though, of course, it's just, you can disapprove from this point of view totally. But I think that the leading figures in aristocratic Anglo-Norman society were not broad-thinking men, and they wanted somebody to follow into battle. And it was inconceivable. I'm not sticking up for them, I'm just saying what I think they believed. It was inconceivable for them that they'd go into battle behind a woman.
But she did a very good job. I mean, there's a brilliant story about her doing a sort of a 40-mile ride, and then she gets gathered up in a sheet and carried on for the rest. I mean, it sounds exhausting.
Well, can I say, what I loved about this book, and not just because it's of the moment, is how many very impressive, strong women are in it. I mean, Henry I's sister, Adela of Blois, is a fantastic figure. She's the mother of the man who becomes King Stephen. But she marries a rather hopeless, much older husband for a dynastic reason, sort of Blois, Chartres area of France. And he turns out to be a bit of a coward in the First Crusade and all sorts of problems. So she basically runs the County of Blois, a big chunk of present-day France, and she runs it extremely well. And then we have King Stephen, who's pretty hopeless too, to be honest. Very nice. People liked him, but he was a bit dim. And when he was taken prisoner of war, that should have been the end of the war, really, when Matilda captured her arch-enemy, first cousin. But Stephen's wife, who's called Mathilde of Boulogne, takes over and engages mercenaries and makes sure that her husband is freed, and really guides him very, very well. I mean, it's interesting. Although these princesses were limited in their ambitions because of the very clear glass ceiling, they could also make their influence very, very much felt. And Matilda herself, the Empress Matilda, Henry's daughter, is a fantastic woman. And she would have been an excellent queen. And in fact, when she was the Empress of Germany, she stood in for her husband and, you know, judged legal cases and did a fine job. But it's just the English and the Normans just thought it was ludicrous, sadly, to have a woman anywhere near the power.
They did weirdly think that she was touched by God, though, which is the story of the fabulous escape when she finally ends up in Oxford Castle.
Yes. So you asked me earlier about my sources. All of them are monk historians. So of course, they're all quite prejudiced in that they see everything as God's will. And so when the impossible happens, such as the Empress Matilda is locked up with no possible avenue of escape in Oxford Castle in the lead up to Christmas one year, a lot of snow and ice everywhere, she decides just to tell her two most loyal knights that they've got to make a run for it. She doesn't tell anyone else. And during the night, she's lowered down the side of the castle in a white dress, in a white sheet, and manages to pick her way through in a white camouflage, really, through the snowscape with her men and gets away. And it's, people were really stunned by this. Even her enemies had to concede that God must be on her side for this to happen.
Well, it was also the idea that the river Isis was actually frozen. So she did, much like Jesus, also walked on water.
Yes, That's it, you see. You can turn anything into a semi-miracle if you want to. And you're quite right. I mean, it just happened that the Isis was frozen, so she could go where the enemy thought nobody could go because they thought it was water, but it was ice.
It's so fantastic. It's so fantastic. So back to your monks. Were you? I mean, did you actually manage to get your hands on proper parchment? I mean, did you get the white gloves on? Because I mean, a lot of these sources are nearly 1,000 years old.
Mm. Well, do you know, it's quite different because normally I do. You know, normally I'm trawling through 17th century documents, but I got to be honest, I don't understand the language of the time.
Are they mostly written in Latin?
Yeah, or Old French, which, I mean, I did French A-level. There's very little connection, is all I can tell you. And I had to get the assistance of somebody at Cambridge University who studies Old French. So I was trying to deal quite a lot. There's the drama of the story of this incredible list of passengers going down on a ship and the reason why it matters and the fallout from such a disaster. That's one thing. But it has to be woven into the context of the time. So I do spend a little time explaining how the 12th century mind viewed the sea, because of course it was a beautiful place, but also incredibly dangerous. And yes, your good captains would understand how to avoid a low tide or whatever, but you still didn't really understand it. And even in my book, and there's about half a dozen really significant shipwrecks, whether it's King Harold, the one who supposedly got one in the eye at Hastings. You know, he was shipwrecked on the coast of what is now northern France. And that had huge consequences. And Henry's wife, her family were shipwrecked in Scotland, which meant that her mother married the King of Scotland. So they were very, very big deals, these. And there was total incomprehension of what was underneath the sea. I mean, the list of animals that they thought inhabited there: sea goats, sea elephants. I mean, you could probably, I imagine a sea elephant was a walrus or something, but all sorts of animals were lurking there, and sirens on the rocks, you know, back from mythology. They still believed in that. So when you set off on a ship, it was a very good idea to get God's blessing. And when people looked for one of the reasons why the white ship went down, they pointed to the fact that, as was custom, the monks came to bless this great ship before it set off. But the sort of drunken hooray Henrys on board shouted and sort of chased them away before the blessing could take place. And so that was seen as, you know, if you're going to upset God like that, you're going to tempt him to have a retribution against you, including loss of all those lives, incredibly important people. You know, it was the women on that ship too. There were in that there weren't many people of the highest rank. There were 18 ladies of countess and above on the ship who drowned. And the devastation, so I touched on earlier how people didn't want to tell Henry I what had happened because they were all terrified of him. But at the same time, they knew that they had lost their friends and their sisters and their wives and their brothers, etc. So they all had to sort of just make themselves scarce because, of course, they were bereft. So the impact was extraordinary, and actually the ripple effect that went on for generations in terms of voids of power and struggles in Norfolk or Suffolk over who's then going to be in charge, you know. And the Welsh decided, when they heard about the white ship going down, that one of their main enemies was the Earl of Chester, the most powerful aristocrat in England. And when they heard he had drowned in the white ship, they invaded from Wales into England. So it was instant and it was long term, the effects of this shipwreck. And that's what made it so fascinating to me. I just realized, when I did this talk 5 years ago, I realized, wow, people really did like this. I think it was the only time they actually snapped to attention to listen. But after that, I had to do the same speech. I was filling in again. Somebody failed to pitch up at a literary festival, and I said, I got one ready to go, a talk. And again, people were very intrigued by that. They were not interested in what I had to say about the ordinary queens of England. And so I thought, well, and I had no idea what I was going to write next. And then I happened to just Google the White Ship because I was just thinking, that's such a nice story. I was not thinking of writing about it. And then it was 3 years ago, and I take 3 years to write a book for research and writing. And then I saw this 900th anniversary, and I thought, wow, let's go for this. And actually, you know, in previous generations, this was an incredibly well-known tale. It's just dropped off our radar. If you go to that old standby, Our Island Story, which was, I think, written 120 years ago, it's the sort of history of England, I think, from Roman times to Queen Victoria's death. And it's very jingoistic, sort of, you know, it's trumpets and drums and aren't we wonderful? But the chapter on Henry I is basically the story of the White Ship. And when I was looking at historians of the 18th and 17th century, when they wrote about it, they apologized for going over it yet again because it was so well known. But of course, now no one, I mean, I don't say that presumptuously, but there's very few people who would have known what the White Ship was, who are under 65. I don't think it's really been taught properly since then.
Well, certainly, I had no idea about it, but also because what's so delightful about the story is that it smacks of hubris in so many ways. You know, the idea. I mean, you just described the drunken Henrys getting rid of the priests, and you know, it was the reason why they crashed was because they were racing the ship already ahead of them, weren't they? Because the king's ship had left.
Yeah, so the White Ship was a spectacular ship. So of course there are no images of it, but what we do know is that it was white, because when the captain was trying to sell the idea of the king going home on it, which would have been a huge honor, he points to its whiteness. And I've talked to the various experts who know about these things, and white was a celebratory color for the Vikings. And we're dealing with the afterburn of Viking time. There's very little difference between the Normans at this period and the Viking ancestors. And so it was really fast too. It had 50 rowers on it. It had a huge mast. We know all these things. And it must have been a magnificent sight. And I love Henry I because he is quite sort of straightforward. And when he had the option of going on this fantastic vessel, he went, no, my arrangements are all made, but I'm sure my children would love a ride on it. It's rather like somebody saying, oh, do have a go in the sports car, but with a drunk driver, you know, and yes. The helmsman was drunk, and they got the real basics wrong. So the captain had been in and out. He was from Barfleur, this harbour on the Cotentin Peninsula of Normandy, very near Cherbourg. And he knew those waters really well. He knew there were rocks to avoid. It was a very good harbour, but you did have to avoid those big rocks. And the main one there is called the Quai Boeuf. It still exists. At low tide, you can see it's big. And I think what happened was there was a sort of overexcitement about having the heir to the throne on board. Everyone was in a state of happy hysteria. They were drunk, and they broke one of the golden rules, which was you only relied on oars until you actually got out to sea, because then you could steer and it was all doable. But they were so excited, they dropped the sail, and they had a good wind. And I think that upended the helmsman. I think he just miscalculated where the rock was, and they got onto it way before he was expecting it. And then, because they were drunk, the sailors thought, oh, we can just push off here. You know, they had pikes and things, we'll just push off. But the way these ships were manufactured, it's called clinker-based. They still have boats like this now. Clinker-based is really one layer of wood on top of the next, and there's a sort of hook of a nail to hold it all in place. It's great. It's very easy to make. You don't need a huge amount. You just need experience rather than a massive amount of know-how. But the problem with it is when one is gone, you're done because it unpeels. So they didn't realize quite how hard they had hit this rock, and it had staved in one side. They could probably have stayed on if they hadn't panicked and been drunk. But because these sailors got their big pikes out and pushed, it split the ship in two. And then in the sort of drunken panic, they started to cascade into the water. I mentioned I'm no scientist, but I had to look at why did they die? You know, obviously they're going to drown. But the reason they drowned it's a sort of cold water shock, it's called. And the one thing you mustn't do when you hit very cold water is panic. But of course, that is your natural reaction. And in the panic, they would have swallowed a lot of water. So, I mean, luckily for them, I suppose, a lot of them would have died very quickly. And really, nobody knew how to swim at this time. It was a very, very tiny, tiny minority who would know how to do that. And there would be people who were in shipping harbors on the coast who had to swim out and get a net or whatever it is off when it was caught. But your average courtier would not have done it. They didn't even like to bath. They were so scared of water anyway. And so you've got these people who can't swim thrashing around. And if they didn't die of cold water shock or drowning, and we know that some of them pulled each other down in their sort of terror, then they would have got hypothermia and that would have been it. So it was really, if you went down, you were going to die. You know, that was the tragedy of it, because they're only a mile off the coast, but there was no hope of anyone swimming ashore. It wasn't possible.
Gosh, it's such an amazing story. I mean, also the way you've written it is so delightful. I have to say, it's written in such an entertaining, fantastic way, and that's mainly because you've got so many sort of juicy details in it. I mean, half the times the names are hilarious. You know, I mean, even Robert Curthose, which basically means short legs, which makes me laugh all the time, and the horrific story about how William the Conqueror was too fat for his sarcophagus.
Oh, I know. I love all these details. You know, for me, history is all about people, and it's, you know, it's not dry facts. I mean, I've always loved history, but I do not want to read a boring book. And so the joy, I'm really covering a period from 1066 for a century. An awful lot happens then. So what I try and do is pick out the best bits and weave them together to give a I hope, a rich context. So for about 10 years after I left university, I worked in television as a TV reporter for one of the American networks. And I was always taught you must write to picture. So, of course, the pictures have to be in people's imagination. So what I try and do is illustrate a whole thing through someone. That one of my most intriguing people is called Robert de Bellem, who is a really appalling figure. He's an Anglo-Norman aristocrat who, first of all, thinks Henry I is beneath him. So he takes him on and it doesn't go well. Henry I is much more organized than he thinks. And then Robert de Bellem goes back to Normandy and is a terrible bully, you know, really a bad man. And I realized that the reason he is so awful is because he's a great rarity from this period. He doesn't believe in God. So most people have a fear of God as some sort of barometer to measure their behavior against. Imagine how freeing it would be if everyone else is scared of God and you're not. So there's one moment at Lent, he's castigated for not observing Lent properly. And he says, so what would you have me do? And they said, well, you know, you should fast, etc. So as a sort of macabre mockery of that, he has 300 of his prisoners in his dungeon starved to death. He's so dark, he's so evil, but he does show, rather than me going, and the barons could be nasty, and they had too much power, and Henry had to subdue them, I take him as this lightning rod of evil, really, and show his fate, where he succumbs to Henry in England, just as Henry takes control of England for the first time. And then he's overconfident enough to take Henry on again in Normandy. And it all ends very badly for Robert de Bellem. So I think it's, look, who's got time to learn all about politics in Anjou? Not me. But if you can tell the story in a pacey way. I like to write with pace. And I knew with this book, actually, it's very interesting because normally I'm sort of there or thereabouts. And when I say to the publisher, look, I think it's 100,000 words or whatever, and it might be 110, it might be whatever. This one, I really sketched it out after I'd done a year of reading every source that there was. Luckily, there's not too many. I mean, God, the English Civil War, there's just too many. But I read the sources, 7 main historian monks, and then various other bits. And then I got a feel for it. And I said to the publishers, this will be 85,000 words. And it was, bizarrely, it was 85,000 words. But what I didn't want, I said, in the proposal, I said the killer for this would be too much weight. It's got to just be something. Also, I wrote very short chapters on purpose because there's a hell of a lot going on. And I think it's you've got to help the reader to have time to digest it. And I don't know how you read. Obviously, you read this, for this conversation. But when I'm reading for pleasure, I tend to read a chapter a day or something.
Yeah, at night in bed, exactly.
Yeah. And what I don't want, when you pick up one of these history books, and first of all, it's 800 pages. And then secondly, the chapter's 45 pages. And you just think, well, I'm not going to make it, So I try and do sort of 16-page chapters where you really entertain, hopefully educate if people want education, but entertain the reader with something that shouldn't be forgotten. And I don't think The White Ship should be forgotten. It's such an important moment in English history. It changed everything.
Well, I think it's absolutely brilliant. I've so enjoyed it, particularly the exploding William the Conqueror, which was absolutely fantastic.
Well, it's so funny you picked up on that because I really enjoyed writing that bit. So yes, you touched on it. So poor William the Conqueror was morbidly obese by the time he died. And they'd carved his sarcophagus when he was a more beautiful man, probably. And then there's this awful bit where they're trying to heave him in to the sarcophagus. And, he's been lying around for a bit, so he's obviously bloated a bit. And so he bursts and everyone has to leave the chapel because it's so disgusting. Now, that to me is so interesting.
Well, absolutely. Also, the pre-ordered sarcophagus, which is what I like, the idea that it makes me laugh.
There was a recurrent theme at this time too, which I hadn't appreciated, was that these men were so powerful when they were alive, and then they were nothing when they were dead. So when William the Conqueror died, he took a long time to die in a hospice in Normandy. As soon as he died, the really important men scrambled back to their castles to make sure they could hold down a bit of control. And then the rest came in and just pillaged his body, took his jewelry off him, and he was just this hulk of meat. And again, with his son, William Rufus, who died in a hunting accident in the New Forest, as soon as he's seen to be dead, his brother Henry I gallops off to take the throne, leaves him on the ground, and he's brought back to Winchester. William Rufus is slung into a cart and sort of comes back to a modest funeral. And it is interesting. Power was so theirs when they were alive, and then they were nothing when they were dead.
But it also seems so complicated, the power, when you actually got it. I mean, but you killed hundreds of thousands of people to get the power, and then you have to kill 100,000 more to keep it.
Yes, it's very animalistic. I really do find it extraordinary. I mean, you're down to the real basics of human nastiness. And I think it's down to this sounds slightly sort of, God, I'm going to sound very academic, but I think the actual power of the system of government was very limited. So you had to really rule through fear. So Henry I was very, very astute with money, always. And he worked out that the most important thing for his economy was to have coins that people could trust. And he was very clear about this. I mean, goodness, he warned them. But there were people who minted the coins who decided to adulterate them and cheapen them. So they were invited to come for Easter at Windsor, which they did. They must have thought it was going to be a lovely reception, but no, they had their right hands and their genitals cut off. So nobody messed around with the coins again. That's what I would say, because that was the lesson. And of course, to us, it's so barbaric and awful, but and I'm not justifying it, but it worked, that's the thing, it worked. People were terrified of him.
So counterfeiting led to castration then?
Yes, it was a very clear equation. And well, part of it was, because a lot of these roles would have been hereditary, you'd be the man in charge of the coins in Winchester or something, and then you probably try and pass on to your son because it's a profitable business. So the idea was you're going to lose your progeny as well. So yeah, it was all quite. I mean, what the one thing? Okay, I say I like Henry I. There's one bit which I cannot. I still get sickened actually by his nastiness or cruelty and oddness. I mentioned he had about 22 illegitimate children, and he used them for power broking. He had married them into families to broker alliances, etc. And he had one daughter who he married off to a Norman lord, and then made that couple swap their children as hostages with another couple in Ivry in France. And the daughter was persuaded to blind the young boy who was in her charge as a hostage. The father of the blinded boy went to Henry I and said, well, I now have the right to blind your granddaughters. Now, you'd have thought Henry would do anything to save their eyes, but he agreed because that was the code. So those poor little girls were both blinded, and because they were the even more wrongful part of the equation in the eyes of whatever code this is, they had their noses cut off as well. And you just think, what? So they lost their eyes and their noses because their grandfather didn't. I mean, you would give them half of Normandy or something, the aggrieved party to save your grandchildren. But he believed these are the rules. And yep, they're my granddaughters, and it's very sad, but they're going to have to be punished like this.
So
anyway, the mother.
Collateral damage, then they were just collateral damage.
They were just collateral damage. Absolutely right. And then their mother, Henry's daughter, was understandably furious. I mean, mind you, not taking responsibility for having blinded the little boy. And she lured her father into a meeting where she whips out a crossbow and tries to shoot him. Luckily, misses. But, it's just so mad. It is Game of Thrones, but but it's true.
Real, I know. So where's your gimlet eye going next? Do you have another plan?
I do, actually. I haven't fully battened it down. So I normally do 17th century. I've just done 12th century with this book. But I'm going to do something 20th century next. And I decided, I really enjoy a good story. So I think I've alighted on one, but I can't really discuss it right now. But I suppose I'm not, in that I don't take myself seriously as an academic, but just as a storyteller of true stories. That gives me a huge amount of freedom to just find the stories and bring them back to life.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, because this was an absolutely rollicking, brilliant read, and I loved every page. This is The White Ship, Charles Spencer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Imogen.